If you are not educated to control a human machine, it is as much dangerous as when dealing with other complicated machines. But it is clear to everyone when planes, cars, or locomotives are in question. But they rarely think of that when considering people generally or individually. I was already beginning to think that the catastrophe would be upon us before I succeeded in doing what I intended. My thoughts very often returned to the Moscow talks. Several times when things became particularly difficult, I said to myself, I will give up everything and go to Gurdjieff in Moscow. And at this thought, I always felt easier. I often recalled my first meeting with Gurdjieff and that night spent with the group in Moscow. Then I was prepared to give the final judgment of Gurdjieff and his pupils. But something had stopped me. Now that I realize how important these ideas are, I became almost terrified at the thought of how easily I could have known nothing whatever of Gurdjieff's existence, how I could have again lost sight of him if I had not asked then whether I could see him again. Among the talks of this period, Gurdjieff several times touched upon the question of religion. What particularly astonished me in Gurdjieff's explanations was the extent to which so much has been preserved in its pure form, and how little we understand of all this. His explanations differed very much from the usual theological and even from mystical interpretations. Christianity forbids murder, yet all that the whole of our progress comes to is progress in the technique of murder and progress in warfare. It became obvious from his explanations that we take many things for allegories in which there is no allegory whatever, and which ought to be understood much more simply. What he said before about the Last Supper serves as a good example of this. Every ceremony or rite has a value if it is performed without alteration, he said. A ceremony is a book in which a great deal is written. Anyone who understands can read it. One rite often contains more than 100 books. For instance, in all the denominations of Christianity, a great part is played by the tradition of the Last Supper of Christ and his disciples. To understand what took place at the Last Supper, it is first of all necessary to know certain laws. Christ knew that he must die. It had been decided thus beforehand. He knew it, and so did his disciples. And each one knew what part he had to play. But at the same time, they wanted to establish a permanent link with Christ. And for this purpose, he gave them his blood to drink and his flesh to eat. The Last Supper was a magical ceremony, similar to blood brotherhood, for establishing a connection between astral bodies. But who is there who knows about this in existing religions and who understands what it means? All this has been long forgotten, and everything has been given quite a different meaning. The words have remained, but their meaning has been long lost. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Russia was growing gloomier. One felt that something was bound to happen, and that very soon. During Gurdjieff's last visit, I tried to speak to him about coming events, but he said nothing definite on which I could base my own actions. During the past 2 years, I had given up all my time to his work, to his groups, to talks connected with his work, to journeys from St. Petersburg, and had completely neglected my own affairs. All my plans had long since been upset. Finally, the great bloodless revolution took place. That was the most absurd and blatant lie that could have been thought of. But the most extraordinary thing of all was that people who were there on the spot, in the center of everything that was happening, could believe in this lie. And in the midst of all the murders could speak about a bloodless revolution. I was surprised by our intelligentsia, who from patriots immediately became revolutionaries and socialists. Even the Novoye Vremya suddenly became a socialist paper. And for the people, the word Tsar had lost all significance. The word still had a great significance for the army and the bureaucratic machine, but the abdication of the Tsar was bound to destroy the whole machine. Russia was in turmoil. After Gurdjieff's departure, up to the time of the revolution, we only got news of him from Moscow once or twice. It was a week after the revolution that I collected the principal members of our group and put before them my views on the situation. I said that, in my opinion, there was no sense in staying in Russia anymore, and that we had to go abroad. Soon after the meeting, I received a postcard from Gurdjieff, written a month before in the train on the way from Moscow to the Caucasus, which had been lying all the time at the post office because of prevailing disorders. It was evident from the postcard that he had left Moscow before the revolution and knew nothing of the events. Meanwhile, time was passing. It was already early in June when I received a telegram from Gurdjieff asking me to come to Alexandropol. In 2 days I left St. Petersburg. Russia, with no authorities, presented a very curious spectacle.